Thank you very much for coming. We're going to put on a presentation that we've not done in the past. This is about my 10th or so Meet the Fed, but we thought we would try kind of a new venue because we always seem to have questions that people ask that we never have time for in the main presentation. So what this breakout is going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about human intelligence, where law enforcement gets some intelligence from, and because of my relationship since I've retired, I do a lot of security research. I want to talk very specifically to those of you that do computer security research and how you can leverage some of that data towards making the bad guy's life as miserable as possible. By way of introduction, my name is Andrew Freed. I retired about 2 years ago from Treasury. Before that, my organization was actually part of IRS. And I spent most of my time, of the 20 years, doing computer security work, primarily any type of network fraud, phishing, malware, DDoS, anything that affected the IRS, I pretty much did. And I started doing this from a very, very long time ago. I have been around since things were out before there was a thing called DOS, but most of the work we do now is done on Unix systems, on large, scaled out co-location facilities, and we still work with the people in the offices, the federal agents, that are still trying to do the same work on little laptops. But what we have started to do very effectively in the last few years is to reach out to the community and get information. So before we really get into the meat of this, I'm going to go ahead and let everybody introduce themselves. This is like a really informal thing. It's going to be your opportunity to ask pretty much anything you want to know. I don't have any expertise on UFOs, although don't hesitate to ask. Maybe somebody in the audience would like to entertain the answer. But we do want to make this interactive, so if you have a question, we'd ask you just come up to the microphone so that everybody in the room can hear your question, and it makes more sense to the people in the back what we're talking about most of the time. If there's anything that you specifically want us to cover and it's not a question, feel free to come up to the microphone. But essentially what we're going to focus in is where federal agents, other agencies get their intelligence to conduct criminal cases. Most of you are probably aware that there's two ways to work in criminal investigation. One is to follow the evidence, which is generally going to be records and logs and things like that. And the second is the human people that will come forward and say, hey, not for nothing, but do you know about this? Or I saw this and I think you should know about it. Right now, I've spent most of my time since about September of 2009 chasing a couple of the botnets, one of which is Zeus. And everybody here familiar with Zeus? Anybody here not familiar with Zeus? Okay. Zeus is a pretty prolific problem out there right now. It's a large botnet, and the organization behind it probably has about 150 members that we know of. So working in that kind of an arena, it's international in scope, and it's very difficult for American law enforcement to subpoena people in foreign countries. The mechanisms are out there to use things like MLATs to make requests to the foreign government. The problem is when you're chasing computer crime, getting a return on your question 6 months later doesn't work well. So what has happened over the last 5 or so years has been pretty unprecedented that many of the law enforcement agencies that are involved in this are now helping each other and are getting a lot of the information through the informants in different countries. So that's kind of where my perspective is coming from what's happening right now. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and make sure the mic's on.
Sure. Oh, good afternoon. My name is John O'Donoghue. I hope you all had a nice lunch and ready to engage in a good conversation. I know I am, so I might start asking you guys questions. I was just on the panel earlier talking about cyber deterrence and sort of some policy issues that enable anybody that is involved with cyber to do their job most effectively. For this panel alone, I'd like to just to focus on what is, from my background, what is manhunting? I was a Navy SEAL. I spent almost a decade in the community. I have a pretty different, varied background, but a lot of it involves computer science, artificial intelligence, things like that. And the special operations community in general continues to combine technologies in the cyber realm with physical operations. So most of my time has been spent in developing those types of strategies, and that's some of the things I wanted to just to share with you today, what I can, and some perspectives. I probably differ from most conventional thought in thinking that we can operate in cyberspace like we do maybe in Fallujah or in Mosul or something like that. We can't go through an alleyway in a tank when we're getting shot at by people in civilian clothes. We can't geographically bifurcate and divide up the internet and make it nice and neat so we understand it better. We can't expect people to be attributable, to have usernames. So how do we operate in that space? I'm not sure I have the answer, but I do have some mechanisms and some processes and some attributes and components that we have done at the very tactical level, looking for bad guys overseas. And when you combine all these attributes, you really build what I call a full spectrum capability. And that part of that spectrum involves cyber. So I ask you, as you listen and you bring up some ideas and some things back to yourselves, just remember that most everything, including some people's espresso makers at their house, are connected to the internet. And keep that in mind, both from a security background, but also an exploitive background if you're in the law enforcement industry or you're just doing collective business intelligence. So if it's connected, it's accessible. And all of that adds to a greater end state as you continue to try to look for people or organizations of interest. So I enjoy speaking and answering questions off the cuff, so I hope you guys fire some off. If not, I'm going to start asking you some. Great.
My name is Kevin Manson. I'm a webaholic. You're supposed to say hi, Kevin.
Hi, Kevin.
Thank you. Okay. Think about this. You know, they got a place called Webaholics Anonymous on the internet. It's like having AA meetings in a bar. Okay, well, let's see. This says ex-FLETC. Any of you in this room know what FLET stands for? Okay. Do I have any cops in here? Any cops? Undercover types? Please raise your hand. I'll take your picture. Yeah. Just out of curiosity, how many of you are involved directly with law enforcement? Would you please raise your hand if you are? They always stay. Always cops are always in the back. There must be some donuts back there. Okay. How about academia? Nobody from academia. Okay, a couple. Okay. And the rest, I assume, are. How about .mil? How about .mil? A few. Okay. The rest of you all .coms? Raise your hand if you're a .com. Okay. All right. I agree, basically what John said. I'm going to ask you as many questions as you're going to ask me because I increasingly realize that I learn more from these sessions than I probably teach. By trade, I'm a trainer, I guess is the best way to describe myself. I spent 20 years at a place called the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, and I was privileged to be able to be at the hub of a group that had about 80 different spokes in it. Every federal agency except DEA and FBI that trains someone coming out of college to be a federal agent trained at the facility that I was located at. And it's located in southeast Georgia. It's an old naval air station. They had blimps. They used to fly out of those during World War II looking for submarines, and they were sinking, tonnage off the coast of Georgia out there. And I'm very fortunate to live in a nice place called St. Simon's Island. Our local player pro is Davis Love, for those of you who are golfers. I was privileged also to train probably close to 100,000 federal agents during that 20-year period. And my shtick was training cops how to obey the law while to enforce it. And it was my privilege to teach constitutional law, which is really my favorite topic. And many years ago, I worked at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and I always try to go back and visit those very historic documents every time I go back there. Today what I'm doing is I'm consulting with a company called NC4. It's the National Crisis Continuity Coordination Center. And this group is involved with a number of very interesting projects dealing with business continuity. And they also are managing a number of online portals to include the US CERT portal and portals for the NCIS, Pentagon Force Protection Agency, ICE, and others. And 10 years ago, I was very privileged to meet a fellow at DARPA by the name of Matt Donlin, and Matt and I shook hands and we created this thing called the CyberCop portal. And thanks to a very good friend of mine who I've been mind melding with for the last 10 years, George Johnson, who is the fellow who wrote the code there. We have about 15,000 users currently, and the purpose of that portal is it's a PDD3 initiative, basically, PDD 63, to allow information to be shared in a relatively secure environment or protected environment between law enforcement and industry. And I don't know if we're going to have another round, or Jim said I needed to fill a little more time. That's usually just the opposite. Usually wants me to keep my remarks short. But I do have them in writing up here. And if I have a chance, I'll read it. It's less than a page. So, thanks. Lynn?
Thank you. My name is Lynn Wells. I'm now a fuzzy-headed academic at National Defense University in Washington. Before that, actually, I've spent 47 years in the Department of Defense, and which 26 years in the Naval Service, and then the remainder in Office Secretary of Defense. Spent a couple of years acting as the Chief Information Officer for DoD. But I have no background in law enforcement. And so the observation I'd make on the human side of the cybersecurity piece is I was with with Lou Gerstner some years ago when he was the CEO of IBM. And he said, how would I know if I had an effective information security program? So the answer was walk down the hall, find a random employee, ask them 3 questions. Would you know if your computer was being screwed with? If yes, would you know who to call to find out how to fix it? If yes, would you care enough to call? And the point was, unless you can answer yes for every employee in your organization, you can spend all the money you want to on technology and you're going to fail on the people side. And I think this is an area where we in this whole cybersecurity world are not paying nearly enough attention. Some years ago, I went up to New York with a group of industry analysts who were going to present the story of their companies to some Wall Street analysts to get, good stock ratings or something. So discount half of what I'm going to say. But the point that they made was that we industry can provide you customer, with any level of security you'd like. All we need is 3 things. We need a commitment from the top that security is important. And I don't mean the once-a-year letter that says security is important. I mean a genuine commitment. You have to be willing to spend money, and I don't mean the one-time purchase of firewalls and guards. I mean the ongoing operations and maintenance to maintain near real-time situational awareness of what's happening in your network. And you got to be willing to drop the hammer on people who don't play by the rules. And I would argue that in government, we are miserable at this. It is much easier for me to get a security violation by leaving my safe open today than by doing something really stupid with my modem. So as we go into the discussion, I'd really be interested in hearing, as we move into a world of mobile apps and sort of cloud computing and internet and all kind of transmedia applications on mobile devices, and people are emailing to themselves the corporate marketing data and all the crown jewels, which instead of being protected by 2-factor authentication in the cloud are now protected by a 4-digit PIN on your iPhone. I mean, how you get around the fact that people are the weakest link in this whole security process. So, thank you, sir.
So, just by a show of hands or shout out, what do you think that the #1 source of human informants is? Anybody have an idea? Well, I have no statistical information to tell you this, but I think most law enforcement would tell you that ex-wives are probably the #1. So if you are married or you have a significant other, treat them very, very well, or don't tell them shit. Because that's probably, if you do something wrong, who's going to dime you out?
So Andy, is your wife going to survive the divorce?
I'm not going to answer anything. It's interesting how you get information. The thing that I think most law enforcement, first of all, want to size up when we're dealing with human intelligence is what I refer to as the 4 W's. First of all is, who is it that's giving us this information? Most importantly, why are they giving us this information? And, it pays to be cynical because different people provide information with different ulterior motives. What is it that they're actually telling us? Sometimes the information that we'll receive from informants may not be very coherent because they're excited or because they don't know really what they're talking about. They just want to get back at somebody, they heard something. And the final W that I've always had in my mind is what's in it for them when they're coming forward. Now, I know that everybody likes to talk about the good citizen that comes forward and wants to report something. In most human intel, that generally is not what happens. Besides the ex-wife, ex-lover, ex-stripper, ex-whatever, The remaining 20% of the informants are probably going to be people that either have been arrested and want to get out of a charge by cooperating, or it could be others that are paid informants. And they're probably among the sleaziest to have to deal with. I'm sure all of you have read articles about informants that like Secret Services had, that the whole time they're working for them are out there still doing something behind their back. So when you're dealing with human intel, at some point, if this is going to be an ongoing, continual process, you essentially have to form some kind of relationship with that individual. And in some cases, they refer to those people as handlers. And there's a reason for that. It's because you have to handle these people and make sure that what they're giving you, they're not giving to others. Make sure they're not out in the street bragging about what they're doing, because they tend to have a short lifespan afterwards. You lose your source of information. But the other thing I wanted to mention is we have a whole new avenue in cyber war and cyber crime that really didn't exist 10 years ago. And that is the so-called security groups. There's a lot of private interest groups out there. I probably can't mention too many by name. I'll mention one only because there's actually a web page, but there's one group that I'm very active in called Ops Trust. And this is a group of about 400 people from pretty much every country in the world that gets together and basically in their spare time fights different problems. Some of these people are with antivirus companies. Some of them are with firewall vendors. Some of them are government. Some are private universities. Some are just government agencies that are not DoD. But we all get together because we're sick and tired of seeing problems. And what's interesting is this has become a social vetting process that we can bring others in once somebody else establishes trust and brings them in. Now, these aren't bad guys. These aren't, quote unquote, the stereotypical informant. But we use everybody in these lists to go out and get the information we need. I had an incident in one of the Eastern European blocks where we had to do a takedown, and I couldn't figure out what we needed to actually take down. I was able to pick up my phone and make a phone call to somebody in Eastern Europe that is part of our group. I got an answer I needed in 3 minutes, made a second phone call to somebody else I knew in our group, and the site was taken down that quickly. But I think the funniest story that I remember early on was when the IRS started getting hit with the Get Your Refund phishing schemes. We had one of our very first sites was traced to Japan. And I put out some feelers on another group that I'm on and said, help, I need to get a site down, I can't reach anybody, the phone numbers and the whois doesn't work, we can't reach the ISP, I'm dead in the water. So I said, can somebody help me? And about 5 minutes later, I got an email back saying, sure, no problem, I took the site down for you. I wrote back and said, oh my God, that's fantastic. Can you get me the logs? I'd really like to see the logs because we're trying to figure out if this is the same group that's attacking us somewhere else. So he said, well, let me see what I can do. And about 5 minutes later, I get an email back saying the logs were attached. And I wrote back and said, oh, thanks, man, I really appreciate that. Are you the system administrator? And the person wrote back and said, nope. So for those of you who didn't quite get that joke, it really wasn't a joke, but what had happened is some good citizen just decided if the bad guys could break into a server and plant phishing, he could break in and remove it. And the moral of the story is you got to be very careful what you ask people and what you ask people to do. Because some people have even less of a conscience than I do, and they'll go out and do whatever it takes to get information. So when you're dealing with informants, you have to abide by some of the laws, at least the important ones, and make sure that the information you get can actually be used. And of course, if it's illegal, it can't be used. I would like to actually have our esteemed attorney here. He didn't introduce himself as that, but I'd like Kevin to talk a little bit about the laws involving information that people do receive from informants and what things can render that information unusable.
Thanks for outing me as an attorney, Andy. I really appreciate that. A lot of the law that deals with these issues has to do with privacy issues. I used to teach the Freedom of Information Act, Privacy Act, and so some of those laws have applicability, but in some cases we deal with informants that have information that has to be classified, so that's an entirely different topic. But when it comes to obtaining information from you as a public person requesting this information, there are certain exemptions that prohibit that information from being made available, and it is protected information. And it will have to do with things such as protect an ongoing investigation, the equivalent of sources and methods in the intelligence community, whatnot. So there are some limitations regarding the kind of information that can be even shared within law enforcement. Actually, sometimes when you try to toss it over a fence or whatnot, the fence is too high, we really can't do that. So I don't want to go into a lot of detail about that, but to kind of follow up on what Andy's talking about as far as this idea of the personal part of this, I think our topic is about human intelligence. I spent a little time in Southeast Asia back in the late 60s. I interrogated prisoners of war. I was located in the My Lai area. I was a battalion S2, and they were going through my files as a part of their investigation. I was there after the incident took place. And Vietnam was not only a place where we were collecting a lot of information, we were unfortunately leaking a lot of information. And the concept of OPSEC really started in Vietnam. The purple dragon is one of the phrases you might hear in relation to that topic. And we were gathering a lot of information, but the information we were leaking, we were really not very aware about it. And I think we're doing the same thing on the internet, both in law enforcement and in the intelligence community. The little ladies in black in the local villages that would come in and sweep and clean in our hooches and whatnot were collecting, I'm sure, a lot of information. And so we have to constantly be vigilant, and I use that term advisedly because I'm involved in a very interesting project right now I would urge you to ask me about, and I have some business cards I'd be glad to give you called Project Vigilant. And that project has a goal of identifying bad actors doing bad things. And it's a group of volunteers, some very high-level people involved in this project. And you know, we rely too much on technology. I won't say too much, I'll say we do too much. There is no enemy on this planet that we could not defeat or neutralize if only we could identify them, number one, and number two, locate them. And so there's a lot of talk these days about attack attribution and whatnot, and I'm paying a lot of attention to that area in the networking that I do. I'm not a real high-level guy in the technology. I'm really more of a I believe that the most important endpoints on any network are the people. And until we reach a singularity event or whatnot, I think it's going to remain that way. And even after we have a singularity event, we may have to rely even more on people to control this thing we call technology. So I would urge you, if you're out there networking with each other, to reach out to other people who are smarter than you are. And that's something I've tried to do very much in the last 20 years, to bring together a group of friends that I call my usual suspects. And we need to do a lot more networking with people and realizing that technology is only an enabler. It is not the driving force, basically.
Just to follow up with what Kevin said, I spend a lot of time studying innovative processes in creativity and what drives creativity and how do you cultivate creativity. And at the end of the day, when you go through all the different teachings of it and you meet with people like an Inca chief in southern Mexico, or you visit some samba schools during Carnival and find out why they build the floats the way they do, you realize that there's some commonality about people. And that's a couple things I just want to throw out there to you. I met with the creative director for Cirque du Soleil and I said, how do you guys sell out performances in India, in Macau? I mean, isn't that like a Vegas show? And his response was like, have you been to one of my shows? I said, yeah. He said, what language do they speak? I thought for a minute and then I kind of responded. I said, unless I had too many drinks, I don't remember them speaking any languages. He said, that's why I can sell shows anywhere in the world. Performance speaks all languages. And I'm using that sort of as an anchor to think about for this session, that when you engage with people, people love to be told a story. We love stories. I mean, our films are based largely off the hero's journey. If any of you went to film school, when they taught us that, you know, a film is constructed to tell a story. So these are mechanisms and processes to keep in mind if you're going to try to find somebody. You know, as these guys said from the law enforcement standpoint, the ex-wife knows probably a lot about that person to give you some personal details, but you're gonna have to get creative. You're gonna have to know the psychoanalytics of people. You're gonna have to realize that a viral video goes viral, newsflash, not because of how it was delivered, but because of the content. Content makes a video go viral. The number 2 reasons why video goes viral, number 1 reason, humor. It's funny. We're all people. We love it. We love a funny story. We send it. Number 2 reason, anger. Anger, like humor, unites. We want to, if we're angry about somebody, we want to propagate that. So I take studies in the marketing industry, I take studies in politics and campaigning, and I take studies that involve other industries, and I kind of put them in a blender and mash them up and say, at the end of the day, just like Kevin said, it's about the people. So think about those as being attributes to a person, and then you with your technical background understand how you can design payloads and design code to meet those ends, or maybe get a question answered. And then one last thing, the best thing I can describe to put this in visual is, we use social proof a lot. We want to be seen with a bunch of friends because that helps us get more friends. Well, the same thing occurs in the digital environment. You go visit a page, how many of you look at how many friends your friends have on Facebook? That is looked at a lot. People don't want to admit it. That's a big deal. Oh my God, this guy has 8,000 friends. He probably only talks to 3, but that's a big deal. On Twitter, he's not a big Twitter voice. He only has 16 followers. Well, if you talk to the guy today about that did the 100 million Facebook people leak, I just talked to him this morning. I said, what's your Twitter count? He said it was at a couple of hundred, and then I had 500 within a half hour. So, we have to look at some cyber manifestations of physical things that involve people. And that is really the first step in law enforcement applications, private investigations, etc., is understanding what people react to and then design a strategy for your person of interest, and do not rule out the online environment as a tool in that strategy.
How many of you know what Maltego is? Good, most. Okay, and how many of you saw the Robin Sage presentation yesterday? Okay, so I mean, this manifestation in cyberspace, online, social software, whatever, of what you can learn about somebody is really qualitatively different now than it was just a few years ago. The flip side of this is, I don't know how, if I were designing a strategy to implant an asset somewhere, where it used to be, you snuck into the files and you put the guy's records in the university registrars so you could see that they went to XYZ University. Now the whole class has a web page, and if Malthus comes before Martin, and all of a sudden you got somebody inserted there in the middle, they says, oh, who's this new person who got inserted on my website? It gets really hard to build false identities in this space. And it would be interesting to see somebody who does this well, because I don't think there are very many of them.
I agree with what Lynn said, but I also think it's something we definitely have to look at. I think people can be duped. I mean, you look at some of these online sites, there are bots galore. I mean, bots seem to have taken over a lot of these sites. They're, oh wow, she's an attractive girl. I wonder how I get all those marketed to me. And then I'll create another persona with a whole different digital exhaust, is what I call it, of different collections, and all of a sudden I'm getting targeted with, 55-plus-year-old men for some reason. So, keep in mind, however we construct said identity, as Lynn said.
Rarely dates them.
Yeah. As Lynn said, it's very difficult to build an online identity, but I believe it is possible. I do believe with enough creativity and I believe it's possible for a confined period of time. It will ultimately.
But actually, the flip side of that, you make a great point, is that what Robin Sage and other things show is that the due diligence that one might normally do, one might have done if you're dealing with paper records, somehow seems to vanish in cyberspace. Oh, 8,000 followers, must be a good person. So
it brings up a lot of considerations in terms of what is trust, how do we validate that, what is real? I mean, what is even real? You have to ask yourself that question. When you see a YouTube video, does that mean it really happened? I mean, these things you have to consider. I don't want to sound like Mel Gibson in the conspiracy theory movie, although I'm sure most of you have written me off as, but it's really something you have to think about, is what you're viewing, and, oh, well, they went to school here, like the Robin Sage course. I mean, how do you really know that? Will we ever get to know that? It's almost like the first time I got an email from a name I couldn't pronounce from Nigeria and told me I won $50 million and please contact me. You guys see those now and you're probably like, delete, or move to spam and quarantine box. I assume that's the case. Well, how does that happen? How have you been conditioned to recognize that? And that is all as we continue to explore this digital realm, this digital environment. Those things are almost second nature to us. But 5 years ago, you would have clicked on the respond, or maybe opened up the email at least. So these are just things to consider. This is an evolutionary concept, and we got to keep asking questions. So I'll shut up so you guys can actually ask questions.
One of the other problems that recently has been posed is validating information. It's very easy for somebody to take a small piece of information, go out on the internet and amass this massive amount of facts that all seem related, and present it to somebody who, having seen these for the first time, would say this is incontrovertible proof that this is happening. One of the reporters I've known for years walked up to me last night in the hall and said, "Hey Andy, I saw you did something illegal, it was online." And I'm thinking like, well, what would that be? I don't remember anything recently, you know. I found online some crypto article, saying that I'm a spy for the IRS, and even though I was a special agent. And they had all this information that was documenting the fact that I was a spy for the IRS. And it was almost good reading, except for the fact it was just totally false. And when we're dealing with informants, we have to be very careful, not only what they're telling us, but what position and how they were able to obtain that information. Was it firsthand? Was it bogus? Is it research? Because ultimately, if we take bad information and start working with it, we're wasting our time and endangering possibly other people in the process. So what they were alluding to with the data on the internet has actually become a problem because it is so easy to amass a pile of data that is absolutely meaningless, but when presented improperly, looks like it is. I would kind of like to know from the audience, what would you like us to talk about in specific? Because we're not getting a whole lot of questions. I would like to target, your issues. Anybody have any?
Just pick one of them out and ask them, Andy.
Okay, you're close. What do you want to know?
Who, me?
You want to know what the guy's name was online so you could date him? No, I'm not going to go there. Yes, sir. Can you get up to the microphone so we can hear you as well as them?
Can you hear me?
No, turn the microphone.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
All right. What I'm saying is that on the other hand, the internet is giving you the option of finding recruitments easily. You can use LinkedIn, for example, to find someone who's at a specific position at the company you're targeting. So on the other hand, maybe it's harder to insert a new recruitment because you have many electronic records, but on the other hand, you can easily find someone you're looking for and try to recruit it by email, by finding his phone number, and so forth.
Okay, so when we're talking about recruitment, that's actually a very good point. That's a double-sided sword. In most cases, informants come forth and present data. It's not as common for law enforcement to go out seeking informants. They'll see cooperatives or operatives, but not generally informants.
For law enforcement, but what about military intelligence or CIA and such?
Well, I'm not in the military, but perhaps...
I'm sorry, can you kind of restate your question? I didn't hear it.
Okay. I'm asking about how you can use the internet to recruit new people that can help you for humans.
Right. To become informants on military issues or intelligence.
On your side,
yeah, that's a question that I largely can't answer here. I would say though that I think that the construct is largely the same as you're recruiting somebody for a business position, right? How do you do that? What's your steps? I'm looking for a software dev guy that specializes in Ajax and has, experience in this particular realm. How would I go about that process? Just as how would you go about your process if you wanted to recruit somebody to be an informant or something like that? I think you run the risk of not coming across as legitimate at first, because put yourself in their shoes. Right, you work for this agency. I would say though that I'm not sure what your traditional background is, but the same rules that are used in the physical realm are used online. It's just the tools are different. So the fundamentals, this is my personal opinion, are the same. It's just what tools you use to approach that person. But I think the biggest consideration you should have in that is one of validating and vetting the individual. And at the end of the day, I also believe that you cannot purely have a virtual relationship, whether that's for business, whether that's for informant. At some point, I firmly believe you have to have a physical meeting. It might just be once, but I just think that as humans, we want to at least see the person, even if it's once.
Yeah, but internet
Actually,
tools like LinkedIn.
what you're alluding to, I think, is related to the WikiLeaks phenomenon, where you have sites that actually recruit people or solicit people to submit information that they probably shouldn't or probably don't necessarily have the right to submit. And, you know, there's a couple ways that these kinds of sites promote that. Number one, they want to provide anonymity to the submitter. But interestingly enough, if any of you watch TED Talks, the person that heads up WikiLeaks just did an interview there. And the interesting thing was that he kind of hit a chord with me. Anybody that submits information that comes from anywhere in the world, they won't publish it until they validated it independently. So as you get into a mass market, when you start getting information, it's even more important than ever to be able to vet that information, because any anonymous information, as for the most part, will have a zero value until it's followed up on. Anonymity doesn't breed good information. Generally, we want to know who we're talking to, and once again, all those 4 W's. Who are you? Why are you here? What are you telling us? And what's your reason for telling us that? And once we can answer all those 4 things, then we can evaluate whether we have actionable information or not. Yes, sir.
It strikes me that the combination of HUMINT and SIGINT would be really, really beneficial, but oftentimes that doesn't happen. I think there's a number of barriers to like technical analysis and SIGINT being combined with HUMINT, from the fact that HUMINT and LES is usually pretty well protected, plus different communities, different people, they tend to distrust, if not completely dislike each other. What would be kind of some suggestions you'd give that could kind of make that nexus work? Because I think it's completely untapped. Thanks.
So I think you're basically asking, how do we validate information we don't necessarily have the ability individually to do it?
Yeah, well, so I mean, a lot of times like signal intelligence or technical analysis will lead us to something that if we could combine it with HUMINT would lead us to a great piece of intelligence.
Okay.
By
and that's actually what I alluded to earlier, the trust groups.
Yeah.
One of the advantages of having a cadre of people is that the collective knowledge is much better than the sum of just the parts. So we have people in our groups that are very much into DNS. Somebody else is very much into BGP. Somebody else is really into something else. What I spend most of my time doing is data mining, passive DNS, and spam trap data. Now I'm talking about up to 2.2 million links per 5 minutes of spam data, and probably 3,500 plus DNS connections every 5 minutes, or I'm sorry, every second. So we're dealing with massive amounts of data. But I still require the input from some of the antivirus people to tell me what is significant. I can find botnets just analyzing my data. It's trivially easy to find a FastFlux botnet. A Stevie Wonder can find it with these kind of data sets. But what does that botnet do, and how bad is it? So what will happen is, in these groups, we'll publish an email saying, gee, I just saw this botnet. It has 15 addresses, but if you look in the last 24 hours, we can identify over 500 IPs. Anybody have an idea what this does? And we'll put the link out there. And then the antivirus person will take his tool set, run it, and say, this is a packed whatever, it's doing this, and it's going to here. And somebody else will jump on and say, so it's really part of this DDoS mechanism. We work in that area, and this is what the CNC is, the command and control, telling this thing to do the DDoS that you just found that's the malware that disseminates it. So as a wide example, that's really what it takes. There is no one organization that can do it all, and we generally have found that when we work together, we're much more effective. Most of those relationships are very ad hoc and very unofficial.
And the thing that I guess I'm getting at is to give you an example. Some technical analysis will take a botnet and track it back to a region or an area. And oftentimes you'll have some LES group or some LES intelligence out there saying, hey, we picked up a laptop with this sort of information on it. And they're like this far apart, but they'll never talk. Either, the human's LES sensitive, and so it's just never gonna go anyplace. And
Yeah, I spent most of my career avoiding working with the DoD because of the privacy or the classification. I always had a problem with when something happened, they would try and classify it. So if you had two offices in the Pentagon sitting next to each other, and both of them had the exact same computer and did the exact same thing, and one of them was compromised through some kind of exploit, they would classify it and essentially prevent that person from telling the guy next to him, hey, not for nothing, but like, patch this. I work in a very open environment, and that's what I've thrived on. I was probably one of the very first federal law enforcement to actually take cases we had and put them out on the internet and say, this is what I got, can somebody help me with it? And when you start classifying things, you lose that ability. And the really sad part about all this is that every time you classify an offense, who are you really keeping it from? The bad guys know they did it. So why are we keeping this from others? It's been a problem, and DoD is notorious for doing that. Maybe Dr. Wells would like to just talk about that.
It just seems to me that the diversity of information that you can bring to bear on a problem now just gives you a completely I was listening to somebody today talking about the New York Times being all the news that's fit to print. Somebody says the model of the news right now is we try to get it right sooner. And the point being, what happens right now is you put out a story quickly and nobody cares much about the initial accuracy. And the way you get accuracy is kind of asymptotically weeding out all the bad information, which is really an interesting skill set of how you accept and how you don't. And so I don't know anybody who's very good at this, quite frankly. I mean, I'd welcome your point about the two offices next to each other, but I'd welcome knowing who actually prides themselves on being able to, winnow out the potentially deceptive or at least inaccurate information quickly.
I agree with you, Lynn. I also think two things. Number one, going back to the Haiti example, I think that was a good example at a small micro level of many disparate organizations working together. I think to answer your question, the best solution often comes from an aggregate of the most dispersed perspectives. The problem in that is coordination and cultivation of all the different opinions and then sort of having somebody in the middle. The best way to do that is when you can get the problem down to the smallest sort of identifiable end state, i.e. this is crowded around, finding this person. So you bring those other people in who you may not get along with, but at some point, the collective group, and there's a mission, guys, that people get excited about doing this, and pretty soon the law enforcement folks bring their data to the table, and then the other folks bring their data, and pretty soon, it's almost like Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego. You start, querying all sorts of stuff, and everybody comes to the table. And so my answer to you is one of trying to articulate what your end state is in such a small area, and then build around that a diversified group of people that you trust. And maybe that's through a wiki page or something, but people can rally around something they understand and believe in, and maybe whatever problem you're chasing down, once you get that quantified, they'll come to the table. There's a website called, I think it's To Catch a Rat. I don't know if you guys have heard of that. I think it's since been taken down. It was run by a lot of the, I don't know if that's down or not, but it was run by a lot of the organized crime people up in New England. If you can't tell, I'm from Boston, and the whole point of the website was if you knew a guy that was ratting, an informant, put his picture up. Okay? Well, that doesn't help all those good guys, but if you're on the bad side, that helps you a lot. That's a good example. I mean, you had people posting things up about all these other people. So I guess in this particular instance, if you really want to build a lethal, agile force, keep the goal in mind defined, small, and bring in passionate people.
One of the things that I found very useful is if you're in a position of some kind of authority over a certain area. So in my case, it was the Internal Revenue Service and network security. If you get your name out there enough, what will happen is if somebody wants to report something, finding who to report it to is always the first problem an informant will have. Who do I call? So if they do a query for IRS or Internal Revenue Service special agent, back then my name would probably bubble up to the number one. So I got a huge amount of information from that. And when we started getting hit with the phishing, I was the one that came up with the idea of why don't we create phishing@irs.gov. Now today everybody does that, but way back then there was no other federal agency doing something like that. There's a ton of data that people forward to phishing@irs.gov, and sometimes they get asked, why did you send this to us? It doesn't have anything to do with IRS. And they'll say, well, because I didn't know where else to send it. So it's very, very important if you're in a position where you want to cultivate information, you have to put yourself in a position of some third party that has no knowledge of you or your organization. How would they find you? If they had information, how easy would it be to get it to your organization? And that actually turns out to be pretty important.
There's actually another model. If you're actually just starting up, if you can recruit directly yourself. There's a man here in Las Vegas named Jeff Jonas. Some of you have seen him on the IBM ads. But he started a company that focused on something called non-obvious relationship analysis. And so imagine when and he was working with a computer, with the gaming industry. So instead of having somebody send in their paper records and have somebody process them, he would say, I bring the following records to the center, to the hiring center today, and have this information. And it would, so you bring the last 5 years of residence. So when you type in, it would say, when you type in 123, River Terrace, it knows right away that that's an apartment house. And so it doesn't let you get further without putting the apartment number in. And it has various algorithms for checking social security numbers. So if you transpose a digit, there are ways to cross that, reference that against your name. But then it lets the companies ask questions like, the phone number you listed for yourself 5 years ago is the same phone number as a known card shark. Or ask questions like, how many people in the purchasing department have personal relationships with vendors? And actually, one of the companies here went through it and they found that over 100 people in the purchasing department had personal relationships with vendors, and 17 were vendors. They were buying from themselves. And so if you have something targeted like that, and he's done some very interesting work with something called data hygiene, which is, for example, they've taken all 128 spellings of Muhammad and normalized them so that whether it's spelled M-M-E-D or M-E-D or with an H or things like that, they can figure out this is the same person. So there's actually been some very good work done in the private sector in this that might be applicable to what we're talking about.
I was glad to hear John kind of talking about passionate people, because heaven knows there are a lot of passionate people here in Las Vegas, but they're not all patriots. And as far as passionate, brilliant, and patriotic people, one thing I'd like to leave with you is 2 URLs if I can. The first one is NC4, and the second one, well actually I'm going to leave you 3. Another one, the second one is all.net, belongs to a friend of mine by the name of Fred Cohen. Fred did the original research on computer viruses back in 1984 for his PhD at the University of Southern California. Very interesting guy. I met him when I met him online. I didn't meet him online, I just saw a website and it said 50 ways to hack the World Wide Web, and I thought I need to get to know who this guy is. And this was in the mid-90s. And so I did a little collaboration with Fred, and he invited me to put on some of our training programs out at Sandia National Labs in Livermore, California, and we were putting on a data mining training program for the Department of Treasury. It was the first one. And I wanted to hand something out to my students. And I kind of used that 50 ways model that Fred had, so I drafted 20 items on what I call 50 ways to protect your information assets while surfing the internet. And I put 20 in, and 15 minutes later, Fred sent 30 back, and it's still sitting out there if you want to take a look at it. And I'd be interested in some pushback from for those of you, because it's interesting how many of those 50 items are still relevant today. It's called 50 Ways to Protect Your Information Assets While Surfing the Internet. And the last one is Project Vigilant, projectvigilant.us. And I would urge you to take a look at that site if you are interested in this whole issue of attribution. An incredible team of people that's been pulled together on a volunteer basis. And if you're interested in that, I'd be glad to talk to you offline. I'd be glad to introduce you to the fellow who is really the genius behind this. His name is Chet Uber, U-B-E-R.
Thanks, Kevin. To echo what Lynn had said in terms of getting all this disparate information and what's non-obvious actually being relevant, if you look at things in, again, to use the term full spectrum, physical and virtual, I mean, if I'm going after a person and I have a virtual entity going after him with some particular thread, maybe I sent the fashion guy after him because I know that this person is into fashion, and then I coupled that with a Formula One persona, and I coupled that with a business acumen that person might be interested in. And then, oh, by the way, I was able to get his speed pass or his fast pass on the freeway there, so when you go through the toll. Now I'm really bringing in all sorts of different aspects to this equation. I'm bringing a cyber piece, but I'm also bringing a physical piece. I'm getting a pattern of life when this guy drives, and maybe there's some geo-fencing going on, so with his cell phone, etc. So there's all different levels to look at this, and I think the key to come up with the best solution is if you can get a bunch of different practitioners from different backgrounds together, and those being non-obvious, as Lynn said, and they work towards a common goal, you'd be very surprised at what come out, what transpires. I run innovation drills for companies and things, and when I pull the mom that runs a cupcake factory in with the guy that's a carpenter in with the advanced programmer that never leaves his basement, you get some really interesting discourse going on. But in the end, you get a really interesting end state that I just don't think would have arrived there if you brought 15 SEALs in a room or 15 law enforcement people. We are entering the world where it's no longer a-dimensional expertise. We are entering a world where the most valuable people are those that maybe are jacks of all trades, obviously masters of none, but they have enough competency to know when a different capability. So I would just ask you guys to keep that in mind. Gone are the days of straight, single-dimensional expertise, and enter the days of when I can bring people in that have many different perspectives on things.
So one of the other things I think is worth mentioning is that when we do get informants, it's very, very important at some point to do some kind of cursory monitoring. I remember about 20 years ago a problem in Central Florida where there was a couple fires. And it later was found that one of the volunteer firemen was setting them because he wanted to be able to be first on the scene and talk to people about how he put the fire out. We have seen in the past where informants have gone overboard after the initial information they wanted to relay was handled, everything was done. They kind of wanted to stay doing the stuff. So they'll start coming back with more and more information, but you have to make sure that they're not in the process of generating some of this work that they're reporting. And I've had conversations with other law enforcement agents that have said that their informant went out and started soliciting people to do stuff so he could turn around and report it and make money. And I think I said that the paid informants are probably the sleaziest and the ones that really have to be watched the most. Yes, sir.
You've talked a great deal about trusting informants, and I'd like to reverse the equation. I do breach investigations in California, and that's what I've been doing for the last few years. I'm a licensed investigator, and in Silicon Valley mostly, and you'll be hard-pressed to find a more paranoid group of people than Silicon Valley executives. There have been many times I've recommended they talk to the government. They advise them of what's happened. They try to keep it a secret, and there usually ensues a discussion in a room about why should we trust those people. Many of the people that I work with are from my generation or a bit older, and they grew up during COINTELPRO when the federal government was pulling dirty tricks on ordinary Americans, illegal surveillance, you know, getting them to lose their jobs because they said something, you know, that they thought was subversive at a PTA meeting. So that's one thing that impacts people. I've heard stories about, you know, how, well, you know, they'll turn it around and leak it, and they're full of, you know, the feds are riddled with rogues and leaks, and they can't get any internal, or they can't get any international informants because they keep getting them killed or arrested. Why should they trust you?
So the real question is, why do they trust law enforcement to come forth with information? I've not been in an arena where that has been a problem, but I can tell you that when you look at, say, banking industry or large corporations that have had internal problems and have a reluctance to report them because of publicity, there are some ways that can be delicately handled. There have been arrangements made with people that came forward that said, listen, we're one of many that these people are hitting. We can't press charges because it'll ruin our reputation, but we still want to give you the information. And we've actually had a lot of people come forth with that kind of information. The problem, however, is that for everybody that's a victim, if they don't report it, they're as much at fault for these people to continue hitting the next person. I think the analogy was, if a woman doesn't report being raped, then she's guilty for the rapist going to the next person kind of theory. There are some laws that require some companies to report certain things. They have no choice. But I think in most cases you're going to find that if they approach law enforcement and ask for the ground rules before the information is provided, they'll be given an honest assessment as to what can or can't be done and what they can expect. And I don't know if anybody's going to lie about it, especially at the FBI level. And I deal with those people all the time. They're honorable. They understand what it's like to have to continue doing business beyond this one case. And they're not going to jeopardize that relationship by doing it. It's a tough problem when you have your corporate espionage or other things that would inhibit somebody from coming forward. And really that's where you have to talk to one another and say, we have a problem, but we can't talk about it. But if we were to tell you this, what could we expect? We're concerned that this is going to happen. Is there any way to mitigate it? And at some point, either the law enforcement officer can work around them and get information, or they can cooperate, or just not follow up on it and hope the next person is willing to report it.
So one of the areas I've been most disappointed with in this collaboration and trust has been something that came out of Presidential Decision Directive 63 back in the 90s. It was called the ISACs, the Information Sharing and Analysis Centers. And the idea is that this would be a vehicle, a forum, where the government could share information about what was happening as threats emerged, and the industry could come in a trusted environment and say, well, this is what's going on in my network, and others could say, yeah, I see that, and it would all be a non-disclosure. And so, well, by and large, that has not worked out well for most of the sectors. And so we asked about a couple of years ago, why? Because we're trying to find a way. It's essential to making it work. Some industry people said, look, we came down to Washington a couple of years ago, this was about 2 years ago, in response to a request by the administration to try to reestablish trust. And recognizing, and so here's a long table, and the govies are sitting at the end of the table, and the industry people are sitting along the side of the table, and their point was, we own this infrastructure. You don't own this infrastructure. This is private sector infrastructure, and not only do we not have confidence that you're competent to protect this infrastructure, but you're sending us totally the wrong message that you're in charge, as opposed to this ought to be a partnership that we would work with together. So I think from a government standpoint, the optics at least, and then the substance needs to change to recognize that there's more of a balance we might have had in the past. And that probably is not quite the same as the law enforcement, where you do have a recognized authority of the law enforcement people, but still this whole idea of public-private partnership, I think, is something that needs more attention.
I was very fortunate because having worked for the IRS, everybody trusted us.
You worked in?
Yes, sir.
Yes, so as I've heard several times over the last couple of days and in past conferences, one of the big issues with this public-private thing is the ability to credential who is authorized to communicate with the federal agencies back and forth. So I was curious, what is the penalty if you lose your federal ID, and what happens to you in that situation?
I can tell you what happens when you lose a passport in Bavaria. You run down to the bakery the first thing the next morning before they open up.
Okay, so you know...
Not speaking from personal experience, of course.
It kind of sucks when you lose credentials. Anybody else have any good questions? Bad question?
Well, we've got a second instance here, but I'm not going to reveal it at this point in time.
I think we'll give you an extra 10 minutes to go get some refreshments. I thank you very much for coming. Any question? Do I have any comment on WikiLeaks? The smart thing and prudent thing would be to say no. I personally approve of sites like WikiLeaks. I think that what's happening right now, and this is not as a federal agent, but we're seeing a dramatic decline in news services that historically have kept government in check by finding out, information and publishing it and raising issues to the public. And I think that WikiLeaks have their role because the press just isn't out there enough right now. So anything that can do to help. I don't believe government should do things underhanded. I think that we should be above board. I think most of us that went in government work did it to be honorable and to do the right thing. Sometimes that what is the right can be clouded, but there's always been a problem with what you can announce and what you're doing. And some will see that as you're being secretive. We see it as being effective. For instance, if we're going to go after bad guys who are doing a certain thing, to go out there and give all the details to the press of who we're going to go after, what we're going to do, where we're going to set up at, it kind of becomes counterproductive because the bad guys read that stuff. So there is a need for secrecy. In some investigations where you're using informants, even after the case is over, you still can't release the identity of that informant because it could cost them their life. Now you have competing interests because press wants to know what it is, they can put it out there, grandstand it, but this could cost somebody their life. So I do believe that there is information that should not be released. I think there's legitimate reason to conceal information, not to be subversive, but to protect people. But I see WikiLeaks as not a bad thing, actually. Anything else? Well, thank you all very much for coming. Really appreciate it.